Welcome to Coffee with COG. I'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors, VHB, Jensen Baird Gardner Henry Attorneys at Law, AECOM, CEI Coastal Enterprises, Back Bay Management, Woodward and Curran, and Gorham Savings Bank. I'm Hope Cahan, and I'm a town councilor in Falmouth, vice chair of the Board of Metro, and vice chair of Portland Area Comprehensive Transportation System, otherwise known as PACS. I'm your moderator today for our discussion about transit disrupted. The pandemic is a catalyst for innovation, and we have three great panelists with us today. I'd like to first introduce Carrie Butler. Carrie has over 20 years of experience working with public transportation agencies. She currently serves as the executive director and Chief Executive Officer of the Transit Authority of River City in Louisville, Kentucky. We also have David Bragdon with us today, and David's career spans multiple modes of transportation in both the public and the private sectors. He is currently the Executive Director of Transit Center, which is a national applied research and advocacy organization dedicated to improving public transportation in ways that make cities more sustainable, fair, and progressive, and prosperous. And last but not least, we are joined today by Price Armstrong, who is a senior transportation planner at AECOM. Before working with AECOM, Price worked for transit agencies in Eugene, Oregon, Boston, and Springfield, Massachusetts. I'd like to give each of you a moment to introduce yourselves. And when you do that, could you also let us know what your favorite transit line in the world is and why that's your favorite line? Carrie, I'm going to start with you.
Great, thank you. And thanks for having me today, this morning. And so I'll start my favorite transit line. It's sort of tied for two. I had the opportunity to travel to London prior to the pandemic, and I love the Central line, or it's like black on the map, and the Embankment Station, and love that. But I also love Muni. I am a huge fan of Muni as an operator, and I think the Division line. I don't know the exact route number, but I think that is like an excellent example of like what transit can be when it just weaves right into the city, and for just people getting things done in their daily lives. So I love the topic of this presentation or panel because, we are living in this disruption and unprecedented times and all that. I think we've ran out of adjectives to use this world or this year, these 2 years we've been in. I had the opportunity to disrupt my life even more by starting a new job in the middle of a pandemic. So I don't know that I would recommend doing that to others, but I have definitely had a lot of disruption in my professional life and my personal life and my home life. I'm at home today because we have a quarantine issue at my work. So I feel like every day brings new disruption, but I think transit is used to that. We're used to dealing with, immediate issues on the fly on the street. So happy to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Carrie. I'm glad you're able to make it. And David, how about you? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your favorite transit line.
I think for me, it would be the number 64 bus in Rome, which happens to pass by the Colosseum. It ends up at the Vatican, but on the way passes all kinds of fountains. And so it's great for sightseeing. But what I like about that is that that's purely unintentional. It's really just functional for people who live there. And so you see, 83-year-old women carrying their grocery bags. You see people going to work, and it's just everyday life. It runs frequently, and it goes to places that people go in their everyday lives, while it's in this beautiful setting of incredible architecture. So I love that combination. In terms of myself, my organization, we're a research and advocacy organization that really pushes for change in public transit. We think public transit is really instrumental. It's a means to other things. It's a means to cities that are fairer, more inclusive, and prosperous. as well as the environmental impacts. And so we're always looking for change, actually. So the last 8 months has been a lot of change, and that's what I'd like to talk about in a few minutes, is how you in the Portland region can really take advantage of that for some longer term changes that have been maybe brewing and overdue for a while.
Thanks, David. And we thought at first that David was going to have to join us from Portland, Oregon. So I'm glad that you didn't have to get up quite as early as you would have if you'd been there. All right, Prace, how about you? What's your favorite line and a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm going to follow on what David said and go with functionality. I think my favorite transit line in the world, so I'm here in Holyoke, Massachusetts, about 100 miles west of Boston, is the P21 Express in the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority region. Because, well, for a couple of reasons. One, it's an express route that was born out of what previously was Deadhead. So they had to go up to Holyoke to start the regular 21. And so they decided, why not have some passengers on board? And it can be an express up I-391. So very clever origin story. It has very solid ridership. I used it every day to get to work when I worked at the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority. And then it was also the first route in the PVTA system to get electric buses. So not only was it experimental and kind of clever in the way that it was born, but also it continued to be like cutting edge, at least in the PVTA system, for being the first electric buses. So I think there's nothing fancy about it. You don't get any beautiful vistas of internationally renowned monuments with grand historical origins, but you do get where you're going very quickly. And so I appreciated that. And just real quickly, a little bit about myself. So I work for AECOM. It's a consulting firm, planning and engineering. I work out of the Rocky Hill, Connecticut office. Had the great pleasure to do a lot of work with GPCOG. Also, just personally, I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, which Carrie used to be the general manager of LexTran. So always nice to see a Kentucky connection. And then finally, this has been a really interesting moment in time. I'm really glad to talk about the pandemic and sort of the impacts on transit, because I actually started my career in transit during the 2008 recession, also thinking about what are the implications of this huge disruption. So it's in my very short career, I've been able to reach back to the skills that I gained at the very beginning and sort of dust them off and hone them a little bit more in the current disruption.
Thanks, Bryce. So as most of you know, the greater Portland area has a diverse set of transit agencies. We've got bus service, paratransit, ferry, train service, and we have 7 different transit providers for over 250,000 people. These transit agencies carry over 4 million people a year. And in 2019, our region made national news for breaking a single year-over-year ridership growth record. And that was during a time when a number of agencies across the nation were either seeing a slow growth or actually losing ridership. And so Price, I'd like to learn from you a little bit about, you've been working a lot with GPCOG and the area, and what have you, over those months that you've been working with, we've been doing the creation of Transit Tomorrow, which is a 30-year strategic plan for enhancing public transportation in the greater Portland region. What have you learned in that, the best, and some background information? And then what impacts have you seen with the COVID-19 pandemic on our transit system?
Yeah, sure. Let me see. I want to see if I can share just a couple of slides to just make a couple of quick points. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for that question. And I also just want to say also thank you. Like I said, this is something that I've thought a lot about, these disruptions and what impacts they can have on transit. So I had the great pleasure. I mean, this was actually definitely one of the most interesting projects that I've worked on, Imagining Transit Tomorrow. It was a scenario planning project for GPCog, thinking about, okay, we're in the middle of a pandemic. What does this mean for transit in Portland and sort of more generally the transit industry? So I want to make two quick points that I think can maybe help set some context and maybe spur some interesting conversation. The first point, well, generally one thing that I've been asking myself is, are we at an inflection point? You know, is this a point in history where the way that things have been operating are fundamentally different from the way that things are going to be operating? You know, there are these moments in history where a lot changes very quickly and then things settle. So in thinking about, you know, are we at this inflection point? You know, I think it's undeniable we're in certainly a crisis where a lot has a public health crisis, an economic crisis, a lot has changed very quickly. So in terms of thinking about how is that going to impact the way that we have operated and what level of innovation we're going to be having, just to make two really quick points. The first one is the old saying, necessity is the mother of invention. I was thinking about innovation and sort of what is innovation and when does innovation come? And I remember there was a lecture that I was listening to from the Long Now Foundation. And again, this was years ago, talking about innovation in the Great Depression. That the Great Depression, even though you would think it would be a time of great stagnation, there was actually tremendous technological innovation that took place during this time period. And as I was doing research for this presentation, I came upon Joseph Schumpeter, who was an economist looking at innovation during the Great Depression. And he, these are up on the screen, he emphasized three positive consequences. And this might be why they call economics the dismal science, because the first positive consequence was the destruction of underperforming companies. But what that did was it released capital and, importantly, high quality skilled workers toward stronger, more innovative companies. You know, another way of putting it, this is what Warren Buffett said, it's only once the tide goes out that you discover who's been swimming naked. So these you know, weaker companies end up releasing more capital and talent into stronger ideas. And you see this with, I mean, there were numerous important innovations that came out of this time of great crisis. But RCA was the example that really grabbed me, where they pivoted because they couldn't sell radios anymore. They pivoted to this idea of sending video and audio over the airwaves. And so they started dumping more money, you know, very precious money into research and development. And by 1939, they unveiled at the 1939 World's Fair the exhibit television. And of course, that radically transformed the way that we consume media. So this is all to say that not only during times of crisis does innovation happen, but it spurs innovation. It demands innovation, because otherwise you don't make it through that crisis. So I'll pivot over to transportation now that I've talked about something totally unrelated to transportation. But on the right, you can see just really quickly a more recent economic crisis that we were in, the 2009 recession. A programmer and a venture capitalist got together, and they thought, man, it's really hard to get a cab, get a personal car. There must be a better way. And so they founded Uber Cab, which of course then became Uber. And it's sort of like love them or hate them. And you know, a lot of people do both at the same time. The taxi industry has never been the same. This joining of mobile technology and on-demand transportation, and I would argue the public transportation sector has never been the same. So again, even during times of great crisis, or because of times of great crisis, innovation still happens. So that's one point that I want to make. And then to pivot to public transportation and set the stage about Portland, Maine specifically, you know, transit has been severely disrupted. I'll take it a step further. I'll be a little bit more provocative. Transit is in crisis right now. Not necessarily a financial crisis because of the very necessary, really important funding that's been provided through CARES, but certainly a ridership crisis, and eventually, I would argue, a relevancy crisis. If there continues to be depressed ridership, at some point people are going to say, why are we dedicating all of this money to a service that so few people are using? So this is, in terms of disruption, I think the transit industry is in the middle of a really radical disruption that's lasted for months. So just how did we get here? Taking a step back, Emily Badger, who's a writer that I like a great deal. She wrote in the New York Times in April of 2020. I won't read the whole thing, but the immediate future is upside down. We're running, snowstorm levels of service on beautiful spring days. Transit agencies are spending their communications budgets begging riders to stay away. And you see that in the ridership numbers. Of course, we were also telling people don't leave your house back in April of 2020. But you see this in the ridership numbers. The lower left-hand chart is Portland, Maine urban ridership. So this is the riders in the urban, or the systems in the urbanized area. Really radically declined March and April, and it stayed pretty depressed. Important to point out, this is not just Portland, Maine. This is Burlington, Vermont. If you look on the right, you see Burlington, Vermont, and MBTA. So this is year over year change in ridership. Burlington is down 45%. MBTA is down 75% in terms of ridership. And what really strikes me about this is how it's kind of plateaued over the last several months. And there's a tremendous deal of uncertainty moving forward. How is telecommuting going to continue? Vaccine distribution, now that we have multiple vaccines, it seems like just getting them out the door is a big uncertainty. But I just come back to that larger question, and I'll stop talking. But are we at an inflection point? Has the transit market fundamentally shifted? If the answer is yes, then what does that mean in terms of in terms of me as a public transportation professional continuing to have a job, but more importantly, in terms of meeting essential mobility needs, meeting the needs of people who can't drive, meeting the environmental goals, land use goals. What does this mean, and how can the industry adapt, assuming that we have hit this inflection point? So anyway, I hope that set the stage, and I will stop sharing my screen and hand it back over to you, Hope.
Thanks, Price. I think that's really a great segue into my question for David, which, David, you've been working with transit agencies across the country, and I'm wondering what new innovation and collaborations are you seeing during this time?
Sure, thanks. And it's great to be here. What I'd really like to do is look just beyond the last 9 months and maybe the next 6 months, and talk about what are some of the lessons, particularly for governance and how we do things, that are longer term answers, things that you have been looking at through Transit Tomorrow, through Transit Together, and some of these important themes of really not just returning to the way things were, but moving things forward. Let me get my screen here, and we're, as I mentioned, sorry. Now these, no, shoot. Okay. Now, there we go. Now, do you see that?
Yes.
And do you recognize Portland? Everybody, is that a familiar Portland to anybody? No, it is Portland, but it's not a familiar Portland, probably to you. As mentioned earlier, we're a national foundation. We do applied research and advocacy, and we work with agencies and civic groups around the country. We've been fortunate. We've worked several years ago. We had the fortune to spend a couple of days in Minneapolis, St. Paul, with Belinda Ray and Pius Ali. Pius was on the Metro board at that time. I believe Belinda still is, and with directors from around the country talking about how to govern transit agencies and how to move into the future. So using this pandemic as sort of a springboard to these longer term sorts of discussions, I wanted to describe what I see as some of your challenges, what we've learned recently, but that can move going forward. So I was president of the Metro Council in Portland, Oregon, and lived there, but only for about 40 years. So only 40 years. So something that might be more familiar to you and more important to my DNA and bloodlines is this map. Now, this is a little more familiar to you, but it's also important to me. And there's some lessons in this map that I really want to share. So I'm going to go back about 380 years for some lessons that we can apply today, because the first Bragdon to come to this country 11 generations back came to York Beach, Maine, about 1635. That's 10 greats of my great grandparents. Now, one of the first things that Arthur Bragdon did was to sign a petition to the crown saying, we want to break away from Massachusetts. So local control and suspicion of authority runs pretty deep in my family and in the state of Maine. Of course, you didn't get statehood for another 150 years, but that was a start. By about that time, my great, about 5 greats, they were in Scarborough. I don't know if anybody on the call is from Scarborough. A couple generations later, they were living in Freeport. That's where my great grandparents lived, was in Freeport. My great grandfather was born in Freeport, but moved to Yarmouth and then worked in the pulp mill in Westbrook. And so that industrialization, big change of the economy in the 1890s, we're involved in that. My great grandfather born in Yarmouth, so we're all over the map there. And then he ended up in Portland. My grandparents lived at Brighton Corner. My dad took the Brighton Avenue streetcar to, he remembers when it was discontinued. He's 93 years old now. Just as he was going into Deering High School, it's now the Brighton Avenue number 25 bus running on that same route. So change goes on. Ezekiel Keith Cushing, he's another ancestor of mine, you know, Cushing Island, Cushing Point, all of that. Lisbon, Paris, Leeds. So my folks are all over the map. The reason I'm telling you, though, this is that my family story really illustrates that Southeast Maine is a very interdependent place. Things change, people move, not just in terms of my bloodlines over 300 years, but the transportation lines that everybody uses every day. The economic ties, the educational ties, social ties around the region. People live in Scarborough, where my folks, my great folks used to live, but they work in Westbrook. Still the pulp mill that my folks worked in. Some people live in Yarmouth, but they go to the university in Gorham and they need to get there. Lots and lots of people come to Portland. They go to medical appointments at the Maine Medical Center, they go to Sea Dogs games. You get the point. There's a lot of interdependence around this region. But with this interdependence, there's also this fragmentation. And that, I think, is what your challenge is. Population of 250,000 people and 7 different transit providers. That's pretty fragmented, frankly. And that is, I think, the challenge you're working on through the studies. And I think that the pandemic kind of brings some concentrated attention to. Hope, of course, came from the San Francisco Bay Area. By national standards, we think of the Bay Area as fairly fragmented. It's about 8 million population, and they have 26 or 27 transit providers. They are starting to cooperate much more now due to the pandemic. And we think of that as pretty fragmented. But on a per capita basis, 7 providers and 250,000 people, that's even more diverse than the San Francisco Bay Area. And so it's this combination that you have, this interdependence and common interests around a region, but with this fragmented governance structure and service delivery. And a tradition, I know this well, the hyper-local control, and everybody kind of wanting to go their own way, and boundaries that were set generations ago. So I think that Transit Together, Transit Tomorrow, some of these studies that you're working on and the cooperation that you are building is really admirable. And the question is, how do you serve this real interdependence while having the sub-regional variation? And that's really what I want to address with some lessons from the pandemic. So some basic principles that I think are pretty old, and some of them date from the early days of Maine, and some of this is just good modern transit planning knowledge. The first is that cooperation among agencies, it doesn't require consolidation. It doesn't require mergers. It doesn't require all the hassle of trying to fit different people together who may not want to be together on everything. And there's a lot that can be done. I mentioned the San Francisco Bay Area. They have a common fare card, the Clipper card, that is used by all the agencies so that a person can use multiple agencies without having different types. In the airline industry, we know about, for example, the Star Alliance, where Lufthansa, where United, where All Nippon Airlines, where different airlines, Singapore, they're part of an alliance, but they maintain their own separate ownership, they maintain their own separate labor agreements, they maintain their own different ways of doing things, but they cooperate on things where it makes sense to cooperate through checked baggage, common ticketing, maybe sharing lounge space, and having a common theme focused to the customer while retaining their own operating rights. So there's an example there from the airline industry. You don't have to merge all those companies. You can actually cooperate, and makes everybody better off. Do some things together and do some things separately. It's, again, my answer up in the Androscoggin up near Monmouth and Leeds, when they were clearing out the woods there to try to grow potatoes and onions. There were some things they did together as a community in terms of the common things of the infrastructure, trying to clear the woods, but then each had their own farms too. So there's this combination of autonomy with community action. Good lesson to learn. Second, that we think a lot about the rider, and that the rider gives us a higher calling, gives agencies a higher calling. There's actually a really good lesson from Germany. The word is Verkehrsverbund, and it is how to group different transit agencies together under an umbrella so that the rider gets to see one schedule, one fare basis, one map, one ability to move around, while the actual underlying operations are performed by different companies, seamlessly sort of behind the scenes. Third, when we talk about innovation at Transit Center, and we're all about change and wanting to do new things, often people's minds go to a new gadget. They go to Buck Rogers or a jetpack or something really exotic. And in fact, in our experience, innovation is sometimes just something simple and doing the fundamentals better, and doing things like, well, looking at the network design and saying, well, okay, so the Brighton Avenue streetcar used to run down Brighton Avenue till 1941, and now it's the number 25 bus, but should we look at maybe how destinations have changed since then? We look at how do we collect fares. In the case of San Francisco, for example, just during the pandemic for years, Muni, of course, runs the buses in the cities, but Golden Gate Transit has buses that come in from Marin County. They've been running down a particular street for a long time. And in the pandemic, with the budget shortfall, they said, well, maybe actually Golden Gate could serve this corridor because they're running the buses there anyway. And Muni can save money. And they actually did that. That too is an innovation. Your Downeaster train to between Brunswick and Portland and Boston, that's an innovation institutionally, bringing the three states and having a regional authority and that sort of local funding. That's an innovation. Same old train. I mean, the train technology is not different. What has changed is the way people organize themselves to deliver the service. And then finally, I think this is always worth remembering, and I know that Greater Portland COG really has this through and through, that transportation isn't just about getting from place to place, but it's about where people live, where people work, and really how your land use is all set up. My final thing, again, just from my main roots, is I lead Dirigo, the state motto. And by that, I mean that the community leads. I mean that organizations like Chambers of Commerce can lead. I mean that Greater Portland COG can lead. This is a great institution that you have with a COG that really can provide that umbrella of all those different agencies. The transit agencies themselves need to do their job. They can't necessarily lead the whole thing, but a COG really can. So can large employers and essential workers. So, it really is about places like this, traditional New England scenes, not places like this that are harder to get around. And really about not just drawing the map, but sort of painting the picture for people. Painting a picture of clean air and strong neighborhoods, affordable housing, preserving natural areas, and the way people really do want to live. So it's the maps, it's the data, but it's also about this being a great place to live and work and do business. So finally, I'll just then close. If you do want to paint a picture, this is 47 Exchange Street in what is now the old Port of Portland. 47 Exchange. It's now the Treehouse Toys, but this is actually the Bragdon Paint Company. That is my great grandfather leaning there against the counter. As I said, he was born in Yarmouth, grew up in Westbrook, had a business in Portland, regional kind of guy, and then over on the left in the hat, that's my grandfather, again, born in Portland, but lived in Falmouth, traveled all over the state as a salesman. So it all fits together. They all came together in downtown Portland. If you'd like to see more of our work, here's how you can find it. And we have all kinds of studies in terms of ridership surveys, ideas about governance, ideas about how to do things differently. And then you can reach me at this information. And again, really appreciate the chance to be here and speak with y'all.
Thanks, David. I'm sure that your ancestors are very excited that you're back here with us. And
Well, they're Eastern Cemetery, Western Cemetery, Forest City Cemetery, Evergreen Cemetery. They're all sleeping. Zacharapa too.
So, Carrie, I want to hear a little bit from you. You've had this unique opportunity of working for two different transit agencies during the pandemic, and I'd like to hear about your experiences and what you've seen with COVID, and then the innovations that you've seen or wish that you were seeing.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I don't have a slide, and I do not have a longstanding family history in Maine. So I hope everyone will forgive me for that. My grandfather did work as a streetcar conductor in Louisville for a predecessor, or I should say, I'm sorry, great grandfather. So that's my bit of transit family lineage. But yeah, so I was, as Price mentioned, I had been working in Lexington, which is about hour and a half, 75 miles away from Louisville for the past 6 years. And, you know, we were getting word in January and February of, you know, this virus, the pandemic. You know, if you remember a year ago, it was sort of this vague notion of what was happening over in China. And so, you know, had done a little bit of research, and we started to step up our cleaning on buses, just thinking, well, it's flu season, you know, we should be doing that, as well as just kind of keeping an eye on everything. And then when I think back to March or April last year, I mean, it was like everything was completely different. And we were really, as many of the transit agencies or MPO or other folks on this call and other, you know, areas of industry, figuring out what to do. Do I send people home? Do we continue operating? What cleaning products do we use to keep the buses and our facilities clean? So, you know, I won't belabor that point, because I know everybody sort of went through that as well. But it really was, now that we're a year from basically that point, you know, to think back of what we did and sort of how we overcome, how we got through that moment in time. And I know how much I leaned on other transit agencies, whether that was through the American Public Transit Association or CTAA. We also have a local Kentucky Public Transit Association, and just being able to email people or call and say, hey, what are you all doing? You know, one of our rural agencies here in the state, they worked with the distillery and made their own hand sanitizer back when that was hard to get. So I think that, you know, I have tried as best I can to think about, you know, positive, like, what can we learn from this, or what is, you know, that silver lining, or trying to put something positive takeaway from it. And I think that spirit of cooperation amongst transit agencies was really important for me. And I was really, you know, so deeply grateful for that in moments where it was very challenging. You know, I was worried about our employees. If the age of 65 and older and underlying conditions, well, quite frankly, we had and still have a lot of drivers even now at TARC that are in that category. And so, I was like, well, am I supposed to send them home? They can't not work, so it was just all that stuff. But being able to lean on other transit agencies and that spirit of cooperation, I think was very meaningful to me as a professional, and just sort of grateful for that. One point that I'll pick up on, sort of this kind of talking about innovation and where you can learn from disruption, and and I appreciated what David said about the sort of shiny new tools and what innovation means, because now, having worked for two different transit agencies, but in between I did consulting work, and I worked for, I helped transit agencies implement new technology products. And we were vendor neutral. I worked for a consulting company that helped agencies do a needs assessment. One of our projects was at Pioneer Valley Transit, so Price made me think of that, but it wasn't my project. But what we found, or what I found in that work, and also being at LexTran and now TARC, is some of the basics, some of these foundational systems at transit agencies are sort of woefully behind where I think they need to be. So, it's and this is, I'm sharing a little bit of my more personal professional opinion, but it's nice to have a mobile app, or mobile ticketing, where somebody can pay their fare on the phone. But if you're still using a typewriter to do your board packet, or you're using various Microsoft Excel sheets to sort of track your inventory, agencies might be able to make some real innovative change and really free up resources internally to do other things, whereas that mobile ticketing may just be a small fraction, and it's not a matter of one or the other, but making sure that you're pursuing sort of both things, so that you get really a lot of value out of the changes you're making from a system and organization wide. So, sometimes people say like, well, what's, Carrie, what's your vision for TARC and what do you want to do? And I was like, it's not all that interesting. We want to have really good foundational systems in our back office, so that workflows can happen. I want to make sure our employees have the information we need, or that they need. We want to make sure that we have good, solid bus stops where people can comfortably wait. I mean, but people, I'm afraid that sounds too boring to a lot of people, but I'm like, you got to have these kind of basics in place. So, I think that innovation can mean different things to different people, but that foundational things can really bring a lot of value to transit agencies. And just having, as I said, having worked at different agencies, and also interacting with a lot of different transit agencies, kind of on a client or consultation side, I'll say all the time, like, there's nothing a transit agency person or employee can tell me that will surprise me or shock me. Like, oh, well, we track our accident data in a notebook. Yep, I've seen that. Oh yeah, our server is back in a corner and there's an open window and rain gets in. Yep, I've seen that. So there's a lot of things that we can do that seem sort of small, but really can bring a lot of value, I think, to the overall sort of output of the organization.
Those are really great points that you both made, that we think of innovation as being something sexy and new and exciting. And you're right, that really the fundamentals are so important to get to that end goal of that seamless transit experience for the rider. And so that's really good for all of us to keep in mind. And I appreciate that you brought that up. Our transit agencies have really been working together during this time, and it's hard not to be fearful, because the pandemic is so uncertain, and we just don't know how long it's going to last, and our riders going to come back. And And I'm just wondering if you have some ideas for how we make space for innovation during this time when most of the agencies are just really worried about being able to cover their daily operations for as long as they don't know, the needs are going to be.
Mm.
That's bad English, but yeah. So do you have some ideas for that? Some recommendations?
Well, one point that I picked up on that the Price talked about in the very beginning, he said a phrase, there's not as many people riding, and we see that consistently throughout the industry. I mean, it's been I've been sort of fascinated that every transit agency has, anywhere between a 50 and 75% decline in ridership. And I think APTA has, with the company transit app, is showing that ridership, and you can compare where different transit agencies are. And it took me a little while to sort of get comfortable with that, because it's not normal that you're like, well, we have a 70% decline in ridership. It's like you like would do everything you could from possible to say that in public. You'd find a way to spin it. But what I realized, though, is that let's call it that 30 to 50% or 40%, those people who are writing are absolutely essential to what we are doing as a country and our communities. They are writing because they are making essential trips, whether they're going to the grocery store to buy food, or whether they're going to a hospital to work. So that 40%, let's call it, those are essential workers, essential trips that have to be made. So again, that's where I've sort of felt really good about what we've been able to do, because that shows this very vital, critical link or critical service value that public transit provides in our communities. If it were not for public transit, what would those people be doing? And I've shied away from the choice rider or captive rider language that often gets used in transit industry. And I think now it's like we've learned we have this essential rider. But to your question about innovation and sort of what we can do and what we're learning is, I think what that means is we have now an understanding of a really core service. Where are those riders going? Which routes are they using? What destinations are you using? And then you have that as kind of a building block for your core service. Now, for the rest, are we going to see people continue to do a 8 to 5 commute, where they go into a downtown or a central business district in the morning and then leave in the afternoon? I mean, I think that's where we have to do some work. I mean, certainly for TARC, the agency I'm at now, but also as an industry, like, we probably won't see that at the same level, and we may not see it snap back, as soon as everybody's vaccinated. So what that means is, if, and I'm speaking very much for TARC right now, we had a very downtown, routes went into downtown, then they left in the evening. We had a high peak in the AM and, high levels of service in the AM peak and high levels of service in the PM peak or afternoon rush hour. Those riders are not there right now at the same level. So now we have to think about, well, we have an opportunity now to restructure our service to meet different riders' needs, keeping that core essential trips going, but we can restructure our service for how people travel around, or the trips that they may be needing to make on transit in different ways at different times. And then, what the hope or what the goal would be is to capture, or capture, I don't like that word, increase our market share with different and new riders, maybe people that weren't riding previously, but now they have the opportunity to take a trip in a different way or at a different time, because they're traveling differently now too. So, it sounds like maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I really do think this is an extraordinary opportunity to really think about core services, core functions, and then how do we make our transit agencies in a new format that meets these better needs, because we have the opportunity to do so right now.
Yeah, I might add on to that. So just to plug that report, Imagining Transit Tomorrow, again, I'll just reiterate, that was a really interesting project to work on, and I felt really lucky to be able to think critically, take a breath, and think like, okay, what does this crisis mean for the future? And that was, Carrie, exactly one of the conclusions that we came to. The MBTA is calling them durable riders, the riders who have stuck with the system through the the worst of the crisis. And one of the findings was, at least in the short term and potentially longer term, just really focus on meeting the needs of those riders, because as the ridership trends have shown, they're the ones who are continuing to come back. So you need to make sure that your service meets their needs. And just to really quickly, a couple of other points in terms of innovation, and sort of the public sector and transit providers generally being risk averse. So how do you innovate, which is inherently risky, for a sector that, like, all of the incentives are lined up for you to not take risks, to not be on the bleeding edge of new innovation and development? And the report sort of lays out, like, okay, the pandemic happened, and then there were trends up until the pandemic, and some of them were disrupted, some of them were accelerated, and some of them very little impact on. And so a couple of things that came out of it in terms of sort of how would I put them, no regrets investments. One was communications. So the pandemic really underscored the incredible importance of having robust communications, and that's something that generally, I work with a lot of transit operators. That's, generally people are always like, oh, we really need to improve the communications that we have with our riders. And then the other one was data collection technology. So Carrie, to your point, the number of operators, many of them have APCs, but some don't. We've actually worked with one operator who is keeping track of ridership on a notepad with a pencil. And, there are like little data collection tools that are pretty widespread, but could definitely be invested in. And that can also help to navigate, like, we don't know what's going to happen to the transit market over the next 6 months, 12 months, 5 years. And so having that, like, robust data collection ability, and data analysis, although that's more on the, like, human resources expertise side, those are sort of no regrets investments or innovations that the report centered on. But it is, I guess I'll just finish by saying it's really hard. No administrator or general manager or chief executive wants to say, yes, we should do this, and then the next day see it in a headline like, you screwed up big time. Like, nobody wants that, because it's taxpayer money. It's not venture capital.
Well, and I could literally talk for hours about technology, data collection, data analysis, communications, and APCs, especially given different, how I've used them as a practitioner. But I think, Dave's perspective nationally and seeing different agencies, how they use that, I think it would be important.
David?
Yeah, quite right. I mean, I think this is the pandemic focus on who is riding is incredibly important. We've done the national analysis. Nationally, it's about 33 to 38%, depends on the system, but roughly a third of transit riders in this country are employed or active in the categories that are now deemed essential. And that includes healthcare, but it also includes grocery workers, it includes first responders. So, and so understanding their needs and really incorporating that into the planning process, I think there is now an attention to that there was not 9 months ago. And that's a really healthy and overdue thing, and being more responsive to their needs. And typically these are lower income people, often people of color who are generally marginalized in the political process, and conventional public outreach, which historically has been very dependent on people who have the time and luxury to come to an evening meeting and express input, or or have facility with input over the internet. Whereas people who are working a couple of jobs, or English is their second language, or they even don't speak English at all, it's much more challenging for them to engage in a conventional planning process. So the use of data, the use of actual experience of the people who need the service, but really, really important, and having that reflected in the sort of in the decision making. The way that is playing out in different places in the actual service is really important too, because that type of demand is more on a shift basis, a lot of weekends. It's not your conventional go to work at 9, come back at 5. And again, I think that segment of the market, the 9 to 5 market, has traditionally been overrepresented in transit planning, and looms too large in our thinking about it. And so I think these are all very healthy things. I think the other sort of human aspect of this is labor management relationships, which in this country, conventionally, particularly in the transit industry, have traditionally been somewhat adversarial and rigid. And that's not to cast aspersions on either labor unions or management. I mean, we need to have both of those types of institutions. But there are other societies where unions and management have more collaborative relationships. And the pandemic has caused some of that to happen, because when there was sudden need in the spring to change how dispatchers and drivers were interacting in the check-in process, in the beginning and end of shifts, suddenly that implicated issues of, well, maybe having these rigid shifts, maybe we need to be more flexible in how people are reporting to work and how they report to work. And maybe the face-to-face interaction, which is lethal, potentially lethal, maybe we move to something. And for example, the transit agency in Pittsburgh, very, very, very thoughtful, innovative general managers like Carrie. She's a version of Carrie but for Pittsburgh. Was able to go to the union and say, look, I know we've got this 750-page collective bargaining agreement that dictates how this interaction takes place, but people are dying. Let's put this aside and figure out a common sense way to do this. And the union responded. So, I think that's another opportunity for a change.
It's a great point that collaboration is not just about being what's happening on the outside. It's also internal.
Right. And I think the other final point I'd want to make on this is that our measures of success need to change. They're not common measures of success in this field. There's hundreds of measures. There's on-time performance. There's, mean distance between breakdowns. There's all kinds of measures, but just sort of accumulating a bunch of data isn't necessarily a matter of wisdom or actionable. And I think societal measures of success for transit are really important. Like, what is the equity of the access for people? How many jobs can a lower income person in the greater Portland region access by transit? And is that how are we going to increase that percentage? And that would be an example. How equitable is the service provision? And that's the type of measure that we work on, that we're developing, and hope to see communities really, really embracing, because then you're actually quantifying the value proposition for the community, and the functionality, and the justice of it all, the fairness of it, as well as what the contribution you're making to the economy. So measures of success, I think, another thing that the pandemic forces us to look at, which is overdue.
David, I'm curious, do you think we'll ever get away from ridership as the primary measure of success? I mean, sort of, that's the one that consistently always rises to the top, particularly if you're talking to like state DOTs or, FTA, when you get further away from the system itself, it always comes back to ridership. But I don't know if there are examples where that actually hasn't been the primary metric.
Yeah,
Because I think you're right.
yeah. I mean, well, I think, ridership, it is important in terms of, and it does achieve some things. Like if one of your goals is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, keep the air cleaner, if your transit system's carrying 40,000 people a day, that's that's better than if it's carrying 20,000 people a day, right? So it's not that ridership is irrelevant, but I think it shouldn't be the be all and end all. And who those riders are really does matter. Are they people who have been disadvantaged in other ways? Are they people who have been sort of chased out of the core area by housing unaffordability? And we need to make more of an effort with that, and have transportation access reflect other societal disadvantages that people have suffered. So who those riders are, that does matter, and that's a subjective value judgment that's inherently political. But certainly, I would say in New York in April, and where I am, if we said, well, the transit agency is still carrying X number of people, but they're all stock analysts going to Wall Street, to me, that's less important than if it's carrying the same number of people, but they're healthcare workers and they're getting to work at the hospital. So it's the same number, but one is more important to society.
And we're
Well,
seeing,
go ahead.
oh, I was going to say that we're seeing people who are in the lower socioeconomic bracket having to move out of our inner cities where the jobs really are. So right, downtown Portland is becoming really expensive to live there. And so they're having to move out. And then also with the pandemic, we're seeing more remote work. So people are kind of spreading out with that. But transit works well when you've got a dense area that we're servicing, right? You can get more riders on, you can have the frequent service. So thinking about that and the equity, and also trying to get new riders back on, how do you bridge that gap of that inner city type of core versus the more rural areas where you have acres and acres and acres between each house, and businesses are really far away?
Well, if I can jump in, because I was, as we were all talking, I think that ridership question and what you just brought up is such a key piece of the disruption that was happening maybe before COVID and before this pandemic. And you're exactly right. Is if you look, kind of across the country, you see there's different challenges. Like you're seeing more, as you mentioned, like in Portland, people are living, and so the jobs are sort of getting spread out. And you can see that over and over across the country. It's maybe worse in really large metropolitan areas. I mean, I think about Atlanta in Georgia, and it's like, it could take an hour to get someplace to get to a job. So the point about transit doing well in more of a dense sort of typical urban environment, I sometimes will make the argument, transit can do well in any environment, but it's a different type of transit. And sometimes the type of public transportation that might be delivered in a more rural setting or in a larger metropolitan area where you have, a big difference in the sort of origins and destinations or homes and jobs is typically a little bit more expensive. So, if you think of it more in the terms of our parlance of fixed route or mass transit, a lot of people on one vehicle going to similar destination versus a more dispersed trip pattern, or what we would call on demand, those on demand trips are more expensive, but we can do it pretty well. Public transit has been, providing on demand paratransit service for upwards of 30 years, maybe 40 if I'm doing the math. It's a higher cost per passenger per trip. So I always take a little bit of, it's like, well, we can do it well, but it costs more, and we can't necessarily charge by rules and regulations. Our fares are set, at a certain level to be no more than double in, federal regulation. So I think some of that is the challenge of, the the development pattern, where jobs and homes are located throughout a metropolitan area, and then that sort of price point of what people are willing to pay or willing to fund for your transit operations.
We're starting to get some questions coming in from the attendees. And so I want to let the attendees know we will be taking questions. If you have some questions, there's a raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can click on that. We've also got the Q&A up if you want to type in your question. If you're in this meeting from your telephone, then you do *9 to raise your hand and then *6 to unmute yourself if we call on you. While we're waiting for people to find their raise hand buttons, one of the questions that we have on here is right in line with what we're talking about. Someone who didn't ride public transit before COVID-19 has been working remotely from home and has been enjoying not being in traffic and thinking about, well, when I return back to work, I'd much rather take public transit. And so, how do we facilitate getting those new riders back on who may have enjoyed this time, may not be thinking about public transit as an option yet, but how do we get those people to understand that transit is out there, how to use it, and why they should use it?
I mean, I'll hop in and just say that one of the most interesting thoughts that was given to me very early on in my career was not only does transit depend upon density to be really successful, density depends upon transit to be really successful. There was a transportation modeling exercise where they removed all transit from the Washington, D.C. area and showed that basically nobody would leave like a 2-mile radius from their house because it would be impossible to go anywhere. And one thing that I think about is that public transportation in low density rural areas is really it's challenging. I've not known any system that hasn't struggled with very long deadheads. Increasingly, volunteer driver programs are becoming untenable, particularly during the pandemic. So that was a cost effective option to provide rural mobility. But many of the volunteer drivers are retirees, so they're particularly vulnerable to the pandemic. In fact, I trying to see, it was either York County or Regional Transportation Program in the GP-COG area that put out a call during the pandemic, like if you're able and you can volunteer, please do. And it's something that we're hearing all over. Until we get autonomous vehicles, if and when, I don't know. It might be like cold fusion. It's always 20 years away. It's a very challenging issue, and there are some technological developments such as microtransit, looking at a way to use mobile technology to more effectively and efficiently distribute demand response trips. But as Carrie was saying, it's like 85% of the cost of running a vehicle is paying the person behind the wheel. So if you have, instead of transporting on average 20 or 25 people per hour, you're transporting 1 or 2 people per hour, it is just very, very expensive. And the last thing that I'll say is that we have 2 demographic trends that are exacerbating the challenges of rural and other low density transportation. One is the trend of people in my parents' generation, baby boomers, aging largely in place in auto-oriented places where, due to macular degeneration, a broken hip, whatever, suddenly aren't able to drive, but don't want to or can't move out of their home. And so they suddenly, they're in this auto-oriented place, but they can't drive. So they depend on this very expensive form of transportation. And then the second trend is people in my generation, the millennials, who are having kids, particularly during the pandemic, watching a lot of HGTV and saying like, oh, wow, wouldn't it be nice to have a garden and whatever, an orangery, you know, whatever it is. And so they start looking to beautiful places like Southern Maine. This is another demographic trend where transit really benefited from my generation being in urban areas and using transit, but now we're leaving. And so this is not only a challenge without an obvious solution, but it's one that's getting more challenging. So that's not an answer. That's actually just saying, hey, it's even worse than than I said, than it originally it came out. But I'll stop talking now and see if somebody else has something to add.
Sure. Well, I would certainly echo Price's point on just on the pure mechanics of operating costs that a vehicle that by definition, because of the low density, can only pick up 2, 3, 4 people in an hour is less efficient than one that's picking up multiple people because they're all arrayed in a dense line. And so transit, fixed route, and this is a big challenge for the Portland area, I think, because of the dispersal of people, the extent of the lower density areas. And where transit really does excel is on corridors where there's a lot of people and a lot of destinations. And this has been the trick to ridership. So if you're running a bus down Congress Street and there's one coming every 15 minutes and it's running 18 hours a day, you're going to attract the people. There's going to be, because there's some people that are on Munjoy Hill and they're going to City Hall, but meantime, there's somebody else who's at Monument Square who's going to the airport. And then there's somebody else by the Pulse and they're going to the Maine Medical Center. And it's just, multiple purposes served by that one sort of efficient vehicle, people getting on, people getting off. What we have seen in terms of ridership trends, while pre-pandemic, it was quite rightly mentioned at the outset of this that Portland is one of the mid-sized systems that has been growing ridership. So clearly, Greg and the team, they're doing something right, at Portland Metro in terms of bucking that trend with pre-pandemic with regard to ridership. In some of the larger cities that also bucked the trend over the last 5 or 6 years, and it's a small number of them because transit ridership has been falling. Those that have been growing ridership, Richmond, Virginia, Columbus, Ohio, they're not mega cities necessarily. I mean, Richmond is a modestly sized place, but Houston, I believe it, El Paso or Las Vegas and other. Seattle, what they all have in common, all of them, anybody who's growing ridership over the last 5 years has done a network redesign and looked at where all their routes are. And they have shifted to a model of more frequency and concentrating frequency on key routes and running at 18 hours a day rather than just sort of the 9 to 5 thing. And so those seem to be, I mean, again, it's not magic, it's proven, it's fundamental. It is an innovation in the sense that somebody's looking at a map that nobody had looked at for 50 years and said, let's think about where origins and destinations are now. So I think in terms of the question about attracting the ridership back, it's being responsive to those and putting the right technology, which in the case of it's a bus that can carry 60 people, putting it in the places where you're going to generate that has been the answer to growing ridership.
And I just want to reiterate that, especially this theme of ridership as an outcome or measure of success, is that was, to Dave's point about the cities that have seen success in ridership, that has been my experience as well. When working at Lextran, we made a decision. We didn't do a system redesign per se, but we looked at places where we could improve service on routes that we knew had a good concentration of jobs and workplaces. And on those routes, we saw, we sort of shifted resources, people, buses, time, and we saw increase in ridership. So, for the past couple of years, I was kind of sitting pretty thinking, well, we're bucking the trend. We've been seeing increased ridership. And then switching jobs, go to a new place where the ridership at TARC had been on the decline. And I was like, oh, I gotta start paying attention to this. Why is our ridership decline? And we're definitely now here in Louisville, we're seeing that. We need to do some of that system redesign. We've got a COA under works, or wrapping up. But I definitely think that point about having quality service, frequent service, easy to understand service is the biggest innovation we can make. We just don't do it enough as an industry for a myriad of reasons.
I'm getting a number of questions about the often disconnect of transit and what they need, and then the local municipalities and what they're doing with their land use. And that includes, are you putting in your bike paths so that people can make that connection to their bus stop? They can ride their bike there, or scooter, or walk. And what are your recommendations for how we can better collaborate with our local municipalities to make that transit more successful for everybody?
Well, and we've done a lot of work on this, and local governments control so many of the factors that transit depends on to be successful. And if you think about trying to run a transit system, many of the factors that influence ridership are beyond the transit system's control. They can run on time, they can run frequently, they can have the friendliest drivers in the world and the most comfortable seats. But if people, so what are some of those factors that municipalities really need to look at? Local governments, even if they don't run the transit agency themselves. One is walkability. That's a big indicator of transit ridership that we have found in all of our surveys, and all the data shows that if there are sidewalks and there's ability for people to walk to the bus stop, and a nice bus stop, that influences ridership significantly. Another thing that cities control, or villages or local governments generally, is that pedestrian environment. But another is the design of the streets themselves, and that signal priority for buses, and saying that, well, here's a vehicle that's got 30 people on it. It deserves some advantage over the vehicle that has one person on it. And so signal priority, or bus lanes where those are justified, those are things that are often in the hands of the city or of the state highway department as well. And so, and then finally, the other piece that local governments control is zoning and housing, and enabling people to live affordably in more clustered sorts of housing. There's a direct correlation between that and the success of transit. In fact, when Belinda and Pius and I, when we were in Minneapolis, St. Paul, it's like 3 or 4 years ago, but because that's a very big region. They have, of course, St. Paul and Minneapolis, but they have, the transit agency has what I think they call it a transit propensity index. And they say, well, if the local government has invested in sidewalks and it has dense zoning, those are all indications that they're creating the conditions for transit to succeed. And so that we're going to put more transit resources there, because there's a propensity for people to use, and there are demographic factors in that as well. They're saying, well, there are more lower income people here. They may more likely be our customers. And so that enables them to say yes or no. When jurisdiction comes along and says, well, we want transit, the transit agencies can say, well, but what have you done in terms of creating the conditions for transit to succeed? And then we can provide the service. It has to be this interdependence, and it has to be that local governments want to help make transit succeed.
I see a few electeds in our attendee list, so I'm hoping that they'll take that back as they're working on their comprehensive plans and different land use policies.
Yeah, I mean, it's an allocational decision, and sometimes get oversimplified to say, well, we're all paying taxes for this, and it's like, well, people in Nebraska are paying federal taxes, but there's not a Coast Guard station in Nebraska, and because there's not the conditions for their, and we don't get agricultural subsidies in Midtown Manhattan because we just don't have the conditions for an agricultural subsidy to succeed in Manhattan, like they don't have need for a Coast Guard station in Nebraska. So it can't just be, well, we're all entitled to the same amount of every possible public service. You have to allocate public services in part in relation to context.
If I could just add, or is it okay if I add just one quick thing?
Bryce, I'm just going to throw out there,
Okay.
we had someone asking if anyone has seen international service for the rural areas that they want to talk about, make recommendations about. So Bryce, in your answer, if you know of anything that you want to throw in, your answer there, add it.
All right, I'm going to talk and think about that, and I'll address it at the end if I come up with something. But I just wanted to, I worked on a project that, and this is one sort of innovation that I definitely wanted to reference at some point during this talk, was the concept of human-centered design. It was a project through the National Center for Mobility Management, and insofar as it's a compelling process, the way that it works, this project, it was focusing on non-medical transportation, non-emergency medical transportation. And it brought together a really diverse group of stakeholders from transit agencies, community-based organizations, municipal officials. And it really focused, and again, this is an innovation that's not a technology innovation, but more a structural management. How do you crack the nut sort of innovation? It really looks at the customer and what does the customer need. And it does, it hinges on a series of deep dive interviews where you interview people who are actually using the system, you document how their day goes and how their day and lives and sort of like personal well-being is impacted by the transportation system. And one of the outcomes was, I forget what the term was, but you basically have a map with a chart of like how they're doing, and then like, their van is late, and so they are doing worse, and then they miss their doctor's appointment, and so they're doing worse. And it was this really deeply personal and at the same time sort of like graphic, quantified representation of these are the outcomes, the very human outcomes of the way that we design our transportation system. And the reason I bring it up in response to this question is municipalities are one stakeholder in the transit system, and municipalities, and especially elected officials, they want to do what's best. They don't run for office to make their constituents' lives worse. Like nobody does that. And so insofar as, you can really demonstrate these are the humans, these are the people who are using the system, who, and these are the needs that they have. And these are some of the really simple fixes. A lot of times, because transit agencies are thinking not only about ridership, but also their state funders, federal funders, their local municipal stakeholders, their board members, the customer can, union contracts, the customer can get lost in the shuffle in that. And it sounds kind of like wild that would happen, but it happens so easily. And so that's one innovation that I want to plug, because it was a really powerful tool. It's called, again, human-centered design, for sort of uniting people behind like, oh, well, this is the problem, and here's the really clear reason why. I'll loop back to international. I have no idea. David, you might have more context, because I know you've been around, or Carrie, if you have any thoughts.
I don't have any comments on international other than my love for Transport for London. I will say, the one piece that I think where American or United States, our industry has done better is with the Americans with Disabilities Act. That was definitely something that was very clear to me when I traveled, in London, that, I was like, oh, well, where's the ADA where's the ADA stuff? And then I realized, like, American, it's not the same. So I think we have worked really hard as an industry to make sure that we're accessible, and certainly to the point about that's sort of a human-centered design element as well. So, but as far as rural transportation and the international, I'm with you. It's a great question. I'm going to be Googling that later, I think.
I know when I was in Copenhagen, and it's not rural connection, but the fact that you get off the train and then there are a million bikes right there, and they're bike lanes and it's protected and everybody's using them. And so you can really get from the train station to miles and miles away because it's set up for everybody to use bikes. And I think that that's a great example of that first mile, last mile connection point. In Maine, it's snowing right now, and so thinking about getting on a bike is not going to be as as easy an option for everybody here. But I think that there are those points that we could be adopting, especially in the summer. I don't know if you guys have seen or experienced in New York or what have you of successful first mile connectors for places with snow and other bad weather
Mm.
hindrances.
I've intentionally only worked in the southern part where snow is only a minor issue, or maybe a week, a snowstorm at a time. So snow, I don't know. I don't have good snow solutions.
David, have you seen anything?
Well, actually, one of the best biking cities by mode share in the country is Minneapolis. And and again, it's sort of the fundamentals, having the facility in the first place, so that, whether it's July or January, that there is a safe place, whether it's off-road path or it's, a protected bike lane. But then they also do plowing. They had to procure plows that actually fit the bike lane, and they actually, there is ridership. It's probably not, it's certainly not at Copenhagen levels, but I think biking can be, it's part of a car-free lifestyle, and it can be an extender on a transit trip for sure. In terms of international, one of my Price talks about formative things you hear when you're early in your career, and I got to go on a college trip to Japan many years ago, and I was very interested in transit and got a tour of the transit system in Sapporo, Japan, and which really much more efficient than anything in this country, and well run and all that. And after the tour of the control center, which seemed very like very high tech, the tour guide said, he said, well, now you've seen all of this technology, you can tell us what the number one mode of transportation in Sapporo is. And I said, well, yeah, it must be the subway, man, this is so great. And he said, well, no, it's not. The number one is the human foot. Number one is the human foot, and because everybody who is taking the subway walked 5 minutes to get there. And a number of trips where people are taking on foot, and every transit trip connects to a trip. So it's a little bit of a trick question, but very true.
So going back to that municipal thought process of how can we make things easier to walk? How can we make areas better for biking? Certainly in Minnesota, I mean, you could bike across the entire state in Minnesota because they really made a conscious effort to put protected bike lanes everywhere. It's amazing. And so we'll continue to think about that. And that we have another question, kind of shifting gears a bit, about the different modes of transit. So usually we're thinking about bus, but we've also got heavy rail that connects parts of Maine. And we have the ferry service. And Price, I'm not sure if you, in your analysis, have thought about other ways that we can use those other services, increasing rail or light rail or what have you.
Yeah, so I was looking around again at the impacts of the pandemic on these various modes, because for a metro area that's not huge, you guys have a huge diversity in the modes that you have: heavy rail, bus, demand response, ferry, and it's been interesting seeing and I'm sure that there are going to be just like multitudinous studies moving forward in terms of what the impacts of the pandemic have been on the different transit markets. And so like Casco Bay Lines, for example, has seen relatively modest ridership declines, for example, because like that is the link. You can't get to, you can't get to the islands without using the ferry. Whereas heavy rail has just seen much greater impacts to its service, to its market, because a lot of those trips are more discretionary in nature, going from Portland to Boston, maybe for work or for a leisure trip, which again, all of those have sort of effervesced like dry ice in the desert, not entirely, but really gone down during the pandemic. And so it does, getting back to the idea of the crisis as opportunity. You have this amazing infrastructure, particularly with heavy rail, and it is really compelling to think about, how do you make sure that infrastructure is being used moving forward, because it's been this huge capital investment, and you really need a lot of people to ride. I mean, there's so much opportunity for a lot of people to ride it. I know there are several. I'll focus on rail just for a second. Several ideas in the hopper in terms of relocating the station in Portland to make it much faster to get to Portland, hop off, and then continue further north or further south, and decrease the travel time. I know that there's a really strong demand articulated. We discovered this when we were doing the Transit Tomorrow Imagined, of a more rapid and frequent link between Boston and Portland, and that if you can open up access to the Boston market with its severe housing constraints, but also the economic engine of New England, then that opens up a lot of opportunity. But I go back to the sort of human-centered design. I guess if my recommendation would be, I can maybe come up with some ideas for rebuilding that ridership and really leveraging that existing heavy rail system. But I would want to do some really like deep dives into like focus groups, talk with customers, former, new, and never used, to think about like, what is it going to take? Like, how can you imagine using the service? I'll stop with one other very interesting idea that I know was interrupted by the pandemic, was Medicaid transportation. There are a lot of people who use Medicaid transportation and need to get to Boston for specialized health care. And so they were working on a relationship between NEPRA and Maine Care, so that they could use their Medicaid transportation voucher to use the train. And so that's a very large transportation market. And it's exactly those kinds of partnerships, and really thinking creatively and working hard to rebuild that ridership. But again, I think it's a huge, I'm looking at it positively. It's a huge opportunity to think about, like, okay, we have this amazing asset. How can we best use it, get in the market that we're currently in?
We've got both sides of the train debate going on in the Q&A. We've got people who want to pave over the rail system so that we can have more of a bike ped pathway that connects us throughout the state. And we have others who want to increase rail. I don't know if you want to briefly touch on that, to kind of talk about both sides briefly, though, because we've only got 5 minutes left.
I would defer to Dave and Price, but my viewpoint is it's belts and suspenders. Why not have both? Figure out a way to have a bike path, figure out a way to have rail, bus. I mean, I think I think this industry transit at least has the tendency to go to like a modal bias. Well, it's bus or it's bike or it's walking, but really it's about all the modes and the best way that we can like sort of allocate those modes in a city or locality. To your point, it was great to take the train and you got off the train in Copenhagen and there was a bike. I mean, we can do more of that here. We just have to kind of put our minds to it. So belts and suspenders, rail and bus, all the modes.
Great, I love it. Let's do it all.
Oh, well, I'll be the practical grandson of New England and the frugal one here. I think you actually have to make choices. And I think you start with what is the market, what are your resources, and that that service characteristics are far more important than the technology, than the particular mode. And you have to look at population density and say, you know, what's the best tool to serve what we're trying to achieve here. So, you know, if I had a choice between, you know, a bus that runs every 15 minutes between two populous places, and you know, there's good destinations along the line, and you make the interventions to make it move fast through traffic, you know, compared to say a rail line that runs 3 times a day and goes through areas that have abandoned factories rather than where people live, you know, I'd go with the bus just because it's going to serve more people and it's lower capital costs. So I think I don't think we should start with saying, well, we like trains, let's see where to put them, or we like buses, let's see where to put them. It's like, well, we have this corridor, we have a market, what's the best technology to serve that? What's the best mode to serve that? And I think you do have to make choices.
All right, we are running low on time here, so I want to ask one final question for a quick answer. If you had a magic wand to do anything in transit that you could, what would it be? Price.
Oh, geez. I guess I'll go back to the couple of things that I said earlier, just really quickly. One is just make sure that you're focusing on the customer. You're going to be pulled in a lot of different directions, but at the end of the day, that's why we're here. We're not here because well, I do like buses a lot and I like looking at them, but that's not why we run buses. It's to connect people. And so that's number one. And then I had a second one, but I don't. It flew out of my head. I'll stay with just one to keep it brief.
All right, Carrie?
Completely restructure the way that federal funds and programs are done. I mean, completely soup to nuts, not just because this is on a Council of Governments call, but really I think more money should likely be allocated directly to the region or to the Metropolitan Planning Organization. And the other one I would love to do is dispel the myth that an empty bus is more inefficient than an empty highway, an empty 8-lane highway at night. I mean, we get criticized all the time, like, you're running all these empty buses. And I'm like, well, what about all these empty 8-lane highways? But completely restructure the federal transportation programs. It would be my number one magic wand.
David?
Well, I think the first one would be to expose and eliminate all the hidden subsidies that our system provides to automobiles and roads, and that there's a lot of general fund money that goes to roads. That people think the gas tax pays for roads. That's not entirely true. That there's a lot of hidden subsidies to automobiles, there's to roads, and certainly our land use patterns and requirements for huge parking lots, requirements or a lot in the land use and legal system that has a huge bias. And you look at expenditures on roads, it's enormously wasteful, even where there isn't demand. So correcting that balance would be number one. That would provide fewer subsidies for roads and balance that playing field. I think the other second would be somewhere along those lines of what Carrie said, more sort of accountable governance structures for transit, more responsiveness to the needs and how these allocational decisions get made, so that we are investing and spending our transit ways in ways that provide better service for people who use and need it the most.
Oh, that's great. And, you know, I thank you all for joining us today. This has been a great conversation and really, really informative. And want to let everybody know that we'll be sending an email by the end of this week with this webinar link, and also the slides from today if you're interested in those, and also the link to the draft Transit Tomorrow plan, so you can have a chance to read it. We will be taking public comment at GPCOG until February 5th. So if you have a chance to read it and have some comments, please send those in. Again, thank you all. This was great. Be safe out there and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.